Here are a few facts you may not know. In the last decade, 5 million people lost their homes, and 500,000 people died in earthquakes and hurricanes. The 2017 hurricane season hit the GDP of Caribbean island nations harder than the Ebola crisis hit West Africa. And most of the infrastructure losses were in housing. So why does this happen? We could blame the Earth or climate change, but in reality, these disasters are largely man-made and completely preventable. Imagine you live in rural Colombia in the 1980s, and like so many of your countrymen, you flee the countryside to escape the drug war and in search of a better life. You build a simple single-story house on a hillside in an informal neighborhood in Medellin, with your own strength, the help of your neighbors, and the bricks and cement you can buy from the local shop. A decade goes by, more of your family moves into town, you're able to build a kitchen and a toilet and a second story, and not everyone has to sleep in the same room. But city government is consumed with fighting crime, and there are no building inspectors to be found, no engineering support to be had. Another decade goes by and you see an economic opportunity. You build a third floor to rent out. And because you don't trust the banks, and it's not safe to put your money under a mattress, you invest in a fourth floor. And in 2020, when you finally feel safe and secure, and your 3 beautiful granddaughters can walk to school without any fear of violence or gangs, an earthquake happens, your house collapses, and everything and everyone you love is gone. Vulnerability, like economic progress, takes years to build. It only takes a few minutes for an earthquake or a hurricane or a flood to take advantage of that vulnerability, destroy tens of thousands of lives, and erase decades of economic gains. 3 billion people will live in substandard housing by 2030. It's a third of the entire global population. Housing should be safe. We have the knowledge, we have the technology, and it's time we drive the political will and the financing towards solving this problem. So, how do we do that? I grew up in a small town outside of Chicago. Neither of my parents went to college. My dad worked for 50 years building houses. He's a brick mason. So I learned the bricklaying trade from my dad. And one of the first things he taught me was you can't lay bricks with gloves on. You have to feel the brick. You have to feel the wall. You have to feel the mortar that sticks the bricks together. You have to feel it all. Bricklaying it's a skill, it's an art, it takes finesse. It's not a matter of brute force. So in those early days, NGOs driven by the numbers, they would say to us after an earthquake, just go train as many builders as you can. Just give them a week-long demonstration, just show them how to build a building. You can't teach someone how to build a house by showing him or her. You have to do it, you have to feel it, you have to take the gloves off. So we have to create an environment where on-the-job building training is the norm, is funded. And giving local construction workers, both men and women, the opportunity to learn this skill on the job not only creates more resilient housing, but it also creates more resilient economies. So that's the first principle, teach people how to build. The second principle is use local architecture. Make small changes to existing ways of building that are already common and already proven on the local market. People know what type of house works best for them and their culture and their climate. So 15 years ago, I spent a year on a Fulbright fellowship traveling around 2 very different parts of India that were hit by earthquakes in 1993 and 2001. And in those early days, for me, resilient housing was very simple. It was an engineering challenge and a social justice issue. Safe housing is a basic human right. But as I traveled around these villages and talked with homeowners, I realized it wasn't that simple. There was this link, this connection between engineering and local culture that had to be understood, had to be appreciated. So I found houses designed by an architect with the toilet inside when the culture was to have the toilet outside. So people didn't use the toilet. I found houses where someone had designed the door on the busy street when the culture was to have a door in a courtyard. And so what did people do? They bashed a hole in the wall and relocated the door. This is not very good for the structural integrity of a building during an earthquake. And the saddest story, I met homeowners who were still sleeping outside 10 years after the earthquake because they didn't trust that the contractor who built their home put enough cement in the concrete. They didn't feel safe. Housing should be safe. So we, as designers, however you define it, engineers, architects, policymakers, contractors, donors, NGO workers, homeowners, we all need to work together to address all of these hazards: heat, wind, floods, earthquakes, access, ventilation, light, privacy, security, trust, to make housing more resilient. So it's time for us to have the grit to resist the next shiny, trendy architectural solution: the paper roll house, the recycled bottle house, the sandbag house. People don't want to live in these houses. They don't drive the political will, they don't drive the financing, and they don't scale. But they do look good in photos. So next we need to put the power back in the hands of the homeowner. It's time that we no longer think of people who live in these homes as victims or as beneficiaries of charity. They should be the decision makers. We need to put the decision-making power in their hands. And when we do that, amazing things, especially with women head of households, amazing things can happen, including resilience. Xing Dian lost her home in the 2008 earthquake in Wenchuan, China. When we met her, she had already started rebuilding. She had one wall that was going up really out of plumb, and she had another wall where she had a window and a door right together. And these are masonry houses, and masonry is common for housing throughout Asia and Latin America. It's what people want to build. And in order for masonry to perform well in an earthquake, you have to have enough sturdy, strong wall and have all the walls connected together. So we talked her through what she needed to do: tear down that crooked wall and build it straight, and put reinforcement over her window and door, because we can't just say, well, you can't have a window and a door. So she worked with her contractor to do all of these things. And then she told us that all her neighbors wanted reinforcements over their windows and doors as well. So this is the kind of change that we're going for. But next, we have to drive financing toward this problem. Build Change has helped to shift an entire global industry away from giving away houses to instead giving conditional cash plus technical assistance. Donors, NGOs, development banks, governments are largely using this model in post-disaster housing reconstructions. You might be sitting there thinking, well, wouldn't this all be easier if governments just enforced building standards? Yes, it would. And this is our first step. When we use conditional cash grants, if the homeowner doesn't build according to the standard, they don't get the next installment. It's a proven model, and it works. But what if that cash subsidy is not available? Will a homeowner actually go into debt to strengthen their home? Will they take a loan? And it turns out there is a segment of the population that will do that if presented with the right access to savings and credit, the right technical assistance, and the ability to expand their home. But wouldn't all this be great if we prevented the disaster from happening, if we strengthened buildings before the next earthquake or typhoon? Strengthening buildings in these contexts costs 20 to 30% of the cost of rebuilding them after a disaster. But the World Bank says that 3 billion people are living in substandard housing. We, as a global community, have made such great progress on reducing poverty, on curing and preventing diseases. But by so many accounts, global housing indicators are sliding backwards. It's time we treat unsafe housing as the global epidemic that it is, affecting or threatening 1/3 of the entire population. It's time we strengthen every building, just like we would vaccinate every child in a public health emergency. But to do that, We need to change policy. So we need the donors and the funders and the governments and the development agencies to recognize it's worth investing $3,000 to improve that home. It would cost $20,000 to replace. And then to reach this next huge stage of scale, we need to leverage the existing technology that we now have available. And this is exciting. We're using VR to enable homeowners to visualize their strengthened home. We're using AI to rapidly assess entire neighborhoods and quickly identify and categorize vulnerable buildings. So we can rapidly compare the cost of strengthening buildings with the cost of doing nothing in terms of dollars and lives lost and people made homeless, so that governments and NGOs and donors can make the right decisions. And the process innovations where we've incorporated with our partner Autodesk have reduced the time it takes us to design a retrofit and apply for a building permit by 97%. Exciting stuff. So the reality is that hurricanes are going to continue to pound the Caribbean. Typhoons are going to whip through the Pacific Islands. And earthquakes are going to continue to rock the Pacific Rim and so many other parts of the Earth. We have an opportunity to prevent disaster. We have an opportunity to prevent people dying in an earthquake. We have an opportunity to prevent a family from losing their one and only asset, their home, in a hurricane. But we have to take the gloves off. We have to bring the financing, the technology, the political will, the engineering, the training, the supply chain innovation, and the homeowners to the table. It's time to move beyond building back better and strengthen buildings the first time. Thank you.